Hey, my name is ShawNshawN. I sell art on ShawNshawN.co and screen reads on ShawNshawNActing.com. Today we're going to review Cruella. So unfortunately I had to redo this whole damn thing thanks to some event popping up. So Cruella is it's directed by Craig Gillespie. The time is 2 hours 14. It's a really good time. Usually I like an hour and a half. But because there's multiple storylines to develop, I think that's kind of adequate time frame to kind of fully flesh out these characters. You have Emma Stone as Cruella Estella, Emma Thompson as the Baroness, Joel Fry as Jasper, Paul Walter Hauser as Horace. So the story is this young girl, she's kind of getting in trouble at school, Estella, and then she's going to be expelled, and so they have to go, her and her mom have to evacuate and go to London and go to a whole different school district. And along the way, the mom's like, hey, I got to stop by, I got to ask a favor of a friend. So they go to this huge mansion, right? And they show up. And Estella sneaks out and like, oh, there's high fashion. She's always loved fashion. So she's seeing there's a fashion show and she's totally intrigued. And then her dog gets loose and her dog gets chased by another dogs. And her mom and the Baroness are talking by the edge of a cliff. And the dogs jump on her mom and off the cliff. And she's like, oh my God, I killed my own mother because of all this. So she realized she feels super guilty. She sneaks away to London. And in London, she meets these two other kids and they're running a kind of a little thief pickpocket gang, and so she joins their pickpocket gang, and that's how they get along until they get to their 20s, maybe mid 30s, I think 20s. And so at that point, she's always been fascinated with fashion, designing the costumes for all their kind of capers. And so Jasper and Horace kind of team up, and they figure out how to get her into one of these fashion designers. So she gets into a fashion design house. It's more of a stodgy brand, and the guy that runs it doesn't let her be anything but a janitor or cleaner, and she constantly, hey, can I try? She's like, no. Can I try? No. Can I try? No. So at the end, she's kind of fed up. She's going to quit her job, and so she kind of redoes one of the mannequins. She's like, it's horrible. She redesigns her own fashion, and she's laying drunk in there. She's like, oh my God, and they're going to drag her out. And right at the same moment, the Baroness shows up and says, oh, let me check out this stuff. She's like, oh, who's that designer in the window? That's pretty interesting. She's like, oh, it's terrible. She had an accident. She's going to be fired. She's like, good, I'll hire her. And so she's brought to the haute couture, and for Estella, it's kind of her dream come true to join a really true haute couture designer versus this other thing, which is a department store. And so now she's going to become a designer. It's going to be really great. But then as slow as she goes along, she kind of uncovers worse and worse secrets about the Baroness, and they kind of turn the tables, and at the end, it's kind of the Baroness versus Estella. So let's get into the analysis here. Oop, it's going too far. So one of the things is this great unveiling of secrets as you go along. There's a lot of different tales of the Baroness that come out that are, make her even worse and worse of a person as you go along. More of a villain than it could be in the beginning. She's already a villain, kind of. You see as a neutral party, and then she becomes a villain, and then it's like the super villain, because there's 3 different secrets revealed of Estella's past. That really changes the story as it goes along, and really kind of, makes you really not like the Baroness, and really kind of root for Cruella to overturn the tables. It's really interesting too, because Estella has kind of this mischievous past as a kid, and then because her mother dies, she's like, oh my God, I got to be a good kid, and she tries to be a good kid that her mom wanted her, and then in the end she just has to kind of let that personality go and just become her true self of being this mischievous person, Cruella, to actually take on the Baroness. In this live action, it's based off the original 101 Dalmatians, and it was kind of these dogs that were like, there was a show dog, the girl dog, and then the other dog was kind of a street dog, and they kind of team up and help these Dalmatians escape this terrible person Cruella, who's making them into coats, right? And so here they kind of change the table. The Baroness owns the Dalmatians, but Cruella has to get the dogs, and the Dalmatians are only 3. This is the 101, which is realistically, because in cartoons you can kind of overlook that there's 101 Dalmatian, but in live action you're going to realize there's shit everywhere, piss everywhere. There's no way for a rich person to manage 101 Dalmatians, right? Unless you have a huge kennel, and it would be kind of a little bit too much for kind of a kid's kind of film to have dogs kenneled. It happens in reality. But in this case, they kind of tamed it down. She only has 3, and I think that works for this storyline. And then at some point, the Cruella wants to get the dog, same as the original plotline story in a 101 Dalmatians. And you don't know that she makes them in the coats, or she makes kind of fake Dalmatian coats. So you're like, it looks terrible, right? So it was interesting because there was a lot of kids brought to this, because obviously it's Disney film, so probably the parents thought, oh, it's Cruella, it's based off of 101 Dalmatian, it's safe for my kid to go. And I think it is, but it was interesting. In the front row there were some kids, and I was maybe in the I was like 2 rows up so I could hear them, and the kids were talking the whole time. You're like, oh my god, this is terrible, right? But you know, kids, they're just nonstop, and their parents don't tell them to shush, and so so they're talking, and they're like at the end of the film, like, oh, I don't like this film, Mom, it's terrible. Because there's no real hero. It's like the anti-hero versus the villain, right? So it's like, how are you going to root for the villain as a kid? You want to love Cruella, but it turns out she's a terrible person in the end. So it's kind of funny to see kids' reaction to Cruella and how they didn't like it. Well, I say all the adults are like, wow, this is a great story, right? It's interesting too because the Baroness has this narcissistic personality, so it's interesting to see that kind of personality type as she overrules everyone, is just cold-hearted, doesn't care. But at the same time, that's kind of her weakness for her vanity, right? So that's kind of how Cruella sneaks in and attacks the Baroness's vanity, and she's like, she really struggles with that because she always wants to be seen as number one. It's really cool too that they fleshed out the story of Cruella as a kid. I wasn't really expecting that. I thought it would just start kind of maybe as a teenager and then she goes in there. But they actually start as a little kid, so you have that nice evolution of character. What you want in a story, you want to have your characters evolve, and she goes from kind of mischievous kids, this good Estella kind of teen to 20s, and then she becomes Cruella, right? So it's this nice transition in that character build. And it also gives you that understanding of how kids, you know, just start off as normal kids and they become into mischief, and then slowly they become criminals. So it has that nice backstory of how you become a criminal. You're just out of desperation a lot of times. It's not because if you're a rich kid, you're probably not going to be a criminal. You might embezzle some funds, but generally you're going to stay on the straight and narrow, I would say. You might get into some mischief, but not over the top. But if you're a poor kid, you can get into mischief way earlier. You get into crime earlier just to kind of pay the bills or get some extra clothes and, you know, that kind of thing, and then that leads to worse crime and get sent into prison. So it gives you kind of a nice origin story and explain to kids how people become criminals. There's also the classic car from Cruella, which is this long stretch kind of 1930s classic car that was one of those car brands that went under during the 1930s depression. You know, all these luxury brands went under, and only the kind of economy cars survived through the Great Depression. You know, the Ford, the Chrysler, the GM that just built your everyday man car. That was the only thing that really survived because people still needed transportation. But all the luxury brands basically disappeared because the demand just went to almost to nothing. And so she's driving this really classic car. First they steal it, and then later it just becomes hers. So that's great because you want to tie into that story, that car. And it looks better in person than it does in the cartoon even. It's also interesting that Cruella kind of teams up with a fashion designer and also a press agent, like her friend from when she was a kid. And they kind of team up to kind of help destroy Barroness through all these different strategic photo shoots in public, and kind of sell the story like, oh, the Barroness is falling apart. Oh, Cruella did this, Cruella did that. And it really just kind of defeats the personality of Barroness. And the Barroness just totally hates Cruella and wants to get her, and almost does get her in the end. There's this great switch up on the butler that you uncover at the very end. You're like, oh, he's actually a good guy, kind of. So it's kind of this secret good guy that's actually working for the Baroness, and there has like a nice twist there. A lot of great twists in the story as, you know, different details are unravel. Really great storytelling, very sweet. I would just describe it as delicious. You're just like, it just comes together. It's kind of like how Knives Out comes together as a really nice storytelling as well. And this has the same kind of really good storytelling, some fun action and stuff, but just enough action to kind of carry the story, and just really fun overall. And this great, you know, debate scenario of Cruella versus the Baroness, and Estella becoming Cruella, and the Baroness becoming this really terrible person over time. She probably had a chance to be some redemption, but she's a total narcissist and doesn't care, and she's just completely ruthless to get ahead. And that kind of becomes her unwinding because, you know, she tells Cruella how to, you know, kind of attack her in a way. So I'd recommend the film. It's going to be great. It's probably a film you might want to even collect because you probably want to see it a couple times. I don't know if people collect films, but I collect films. If you'd like to subscribe, you can subscribe below. And I'll see you in the next movie review. Thanks for watching, guys.